Good afternoon. On behalf of the entire team at ENAiBLE, welcome to another edition of the ENAiBLE Speaker Series. My name is Andrew Lee. I'm an assistant professor at the Tepper School of Business here at Carnegie Mellon University. A bit of info if this is your first ENAiBLE event. ENAiBLE is a new initiative at CMU involving the School of Computer Science and the Tepper School of Business. What do we do? In short, we are a retail and services collaborative. Our mission is to create more humane, efficient, and positive retail and service experiences. We offer a unique forum for helping the retail and service industries meet the needs of their customers through advances in technology, in design, and most exciting for us, the intersection of those two. We achieve our mission in part through events such as this, and also through roundtables and kind of particular events on specific topics of direct interest to the industry, thereby building a unique community of practice that combines design and technology under a single initiative. As a side note, if there are specific areas that you in the audience are interested in, please get in touch with us, and you can do that through the link on this slide. That's cmu.edu/ENAiBLE, ENAiBLE. Just a few logistics before we dive in. I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers, and then we'll let them have a conversation for roughly 30 minutes. And then finally, we'll open up to audience Q&A. This event is on the record and is being recorded. And if you have a question, which we highly encourage, if you have a question, there's a button that says Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can click on that, post your question, and we'll put it in the queue for our open Q&A session at the end of today. Okay, so without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our speakers for today. First, Paul Pangaro, co-founder of ENAiBLE and professor of practice at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute, which is part of the School of Computer Science. Paul, would you like to say a few words about your background and interests?
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, just briefly. My background's a mix of humanities, computer science, cybernetics, and these things led me to write a lot of code and want to design software better, but also to try to design organizations, which is much, much harder. And it's one reason why I'm excited to be here today with and to be paired with Sean. But most of my career has been startups, often as co-founder, running product teams sometimes, and having the most fun in the trenches writing code. But my main interest is fostering human-computer interactions that are most like conversations, like human conversations in any medium, not just voice, but even through Zoom and with text and browsers, all kinds of stuff like that. And of course, conversations are important in organizations. And I've spent time trying to help organizations client-wide and manage organizational change in a better way, and a little bit of future casting. But I'm excited to be here with Sean, who's turned this into a science, as I understand it.
Thanks, Paul. So finally, our kind of honored guest for today is Sean Amarati, who wears many hats in and outside CMU. A subset of that list includes a distinguished service professor of entrepreneurship at the Tepper School of Business, director of Carnegie Mellon's Corporate Startup Lab, partner at Birchmere Ventures, author of the book, The Science of Growth, and host of the podcast, Agile Giants. Sean, I want to give you a chance to add a few words about yourself, and then I'm going to let Paul kick off the discussion.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so about 20 years ago, I was a research fellow at Carnegie Mellon. I walked into my advisor's office and I told him, I don't know what I want to be, but I know one thing for sure. I do not want to be a professor, which is it's a good lesson about entrepreneurs. We're often wrong, but we're never uncertain about that being incorrect. So today, if there's one promise, it's that Paul and I will be certain, and we'll give you provocative things to think about, and the rest will shake out. But over the kind of 20 years from when I left to now, spent about 10 years starting and selling companies. Started a company that was LinkedIn's first acquisition, sold a company to Morgan Stanley, do a private equity roll-up, and then realized as much fun as starting companies was, helping others start companies was a lot of fun. So snuck in the back door at Carnegie Mellon, started teaching an evening entrepreneurship class, started investing at the venture firm. And then about 4 years ago, got really interested in why all these big companies were spending time with startups and spending time with startup resources. So I wrote a book. The book did better than it frankly deserved to do, transparently. And as it kind of took off, part of the reason it took off is all these big companies kept buying it. And as I spent time with these big companies, I realized they're trying to rediscover or recatalyze their entrepreneurial roots. And so myself and the team that was running the Schwartz Center at the time, Lori, who was the provost at the time, and the then dean of the Tepper School, created with me this corporate startup lab. And we spent the last few years looking at how large companies can build startups inside these large companies. And we can talk a little bit more about that, or whatever you want today, Paul, but it's a great honor to be here. I see a lot of friends in the attendee list, so hopefully you guys will ask good questions and make this a conversation about what you want to hear, not just what Paul and I want to talk about.
Great, Sean. Thanks so much. It's really great to have you here. And I appreciate also your willingness to make it a conversation. I think that's better in lots of ways. As you've heard, that's my interest in general. So I'm fascinated by your trajectory. Mine is sort of a different parallel universe. But let's start out with this innovation thing, and let's try to talk about that a little bit. Do you have a definition of innovation you like to use?
Yeah, so when I think about innovation, I think sometimes it's helpful to start with defining creativity and then relate that to innovation, right? So when I think about creativity, I think about that as spending resources. In the case of a big company, that may be money. In the case of a small startup, that might be just sweat equity, but spending resources to come up with creative ideas. And I think about innovation as spending those ideas to make money. And in aggregate, what you want to do is you want to make sure, and you won't necessarily do this 100% of the time. In fact, I would argue if it's truly innovation, it won't happen 100% of the time. But you want to make sure in aggregate, you're getting more money back at the end of that ideas to money than you're investing on the front end, sort of money and resources into coming up with those ideas. So creativity, spending money to come up with ideas; innovation, spending ideas to generate more value back.
I get it. And that's a really concise, I think, business idea behind innovation. Some colleagues of mine and I, a few years ago, made a big concept map, and we thought the simplest way of thinking about it is an insight, right? It's got to be something new. An insight that leads to a change, but not just any kind of change, but a change that has value. So in the world, that's how we think of innovation. And I think you'll agree that the challenge is, how do you come up with that insight as a starting point? And then how do you bring that insight into the world to bring about the change and the positivity? Yours is a business point of view from the money side. That's all great. But of course, we want to do good in the world.
Sure,
so
absolutely, right. So sort of adjacent to creativity and innovation, I would talk about entrepreneurship, right? So to me, an entrepreneur is someone who looks out into the world with that insight, right? And changes how the world works to make it better for their definition of better, right? And so, you know, we did a program this fall at the Exec Ed program with 20 nonprofits that served kind of mission around diversity and inclusion, right? And the entrepreneurship that those nonprofits did was very different than the entrepreneurship in a sort of normal for-profit business setting, but it's still looking out into the world, seeing things that aren't the way they should be, and building products and services that make the world the way it ought to be.
So surely big corporations have some of that desire. Yes, there's the need for profit and growth and all of the usual stuff. Why do you think so many corporations needed your book and didn't know how to do it already, whereas startups kind of know how to do it already? Or what do you think?
Yeah, so I think that there's a bunch of reasons why, but some of what I do with a lot of these companies, and again, I see a lot of them on the attendee list right now, is, you know, I go in and I just tell them, you know what, you can be an entrepreneur. I think one of the really unfortunate things that's happened in the last kind of 10 to 15 years in entrepreneurship, and overall, I think the study of entrepreneurship has improved in many, many ways, and we can talk about that. But one of the downsides, I think, is that in a lot of people's views, entrepreneurship has become relegated to 20 somethings wearing skinny jeans and t-shirts with an engineering degree from a school named Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, or MIT. And obviously, as a Carnegie Mellon employee, I think that's an important type of entrepreneurship, but that is in no way an exhaustive definition of entrepreneurship, right? And so I think what's happened is some of these companies, they just lack the confidence. I'll often have companies say to me, well, do you really think we can do this? And what I think is interesting about that, Paul, is if you were to ask those same people who are asking that question, do you think we can really do this? Tell me the most innovative products of the last 20 years. You know, typically the products that will be mentioned will include Tesla. It will include the Apple iPhone, right? And it will include some type of consumer product. And lately, I think because of the pandemic, you tend to hear the Peloton or some type of connected fitness device. Like those are the most common answers. What's interesting about that is one of those three companies was started by a very big company. It turns out Apple was a big company before Apple created this product. Now it's a much bigger company today, and so like, there's this amazing sort of like, well, can we do it? And also, sorry, Paul, go ahead. I saw you for time out there.
Time out. Forgive me for interrupting. Apple is an exception. I don't think you can use that as an example of how it can be done by others. And also,
well, all three of those are exceptions for what it's worth.
Yeah, but doesn't that undercut what you're just trying to say, no, which is that big companies can do it?
No. So all three. So just like Apple's an exception for big companies.
Any big company can become an exception?
No. Different. Yes, but different point. Just like Apple is an exception as it relates to their peer group.
Yeah.
So are Tesla and Peloton. Like by definition, the way I frame that question, tell me the most innovative products. I am explicitly picking top decile companies. Now, if you want to say, can everybody do it? We can have that debate too. But the point is the fact that Apple's exceptional, so is Tesla, so is Peloton. Okay. These are inherently exceptional companies.
Okay. So in this context, right, I don't think you're saying that the companies who have come to talk to us today should be encouraged to think that they can become the next Apple. I don't think you're saying that.
I am not saying they should be encouraged to think they're the next Apple. I am saying do not fall into the trap. And there's an attendee on the line who I said this with him and his CEO 3 years ago. He is at a grocery store. I won't say which one it is. He was at a grocery store, and they sort of set the straw man up of like, well, Amazon's not us, right? And then Whole Foods bought Amazon, and they feel very, very different today. So do you need to be Apple? No, but what you do need to do is you need to realize that your peer group is much bigger and broader than you think it is.
Right. And what you said earlier about entrepreneurship, and you can imagine entrepreneurship in many, many different contexts. But I think there's an elephant in the room, which is that in my experience, great companies become great because they get better and better doing what they're currently doing. And then they kind of narrow their scope and they realize that their efficiencies and their profits, and they're making a surplus from a surplus in the cliche way of talking about economic growth, they become narrower and narrower. And then when the world changes, they don't have the language for seeing the world as it's different.
So I would push back on that a little bit. I would say that's what good companies do, not what great companies do.
Okay.
Right? I think that good companies absolutely do what you just described, which is they climb the hill, and when they're on the top of the hill, they don't bother to pop their head up and realize that there's a mountain one hill over.
Great. So you have a hint there about what could make them great. What should they do to become great from good?
Sure. But here's the thing. Great companies almost always are not one-trick ponies, right? So, and I think I would actually say, like, if you were to categorize truly great companies, they're not one-trick ponies. And what I mean by that is, you may remember the reference, you may not, but this was a number of years ago, early days of Google. Someone asked Steve Ballmer, like, well, what do you think about Google? Right. So Steve Ballmer, CEO of Microsoft, what do you think about Google? And he said, well, it's a really great one-trick pony. It's an incredible trick. but all Google is a one-trick pony. Now you can make some interesting leadership comments about what happened over the next decade for both those companies, but I would make a different point, which is that it was probably a fair critique at the time, but for Google to stay great, they had to become more than a one-trick pony, and they certainly are today. And actually, when you look across companies that have staying power across these lists, whether you want to use the S&P 500 or you want to use the whatever list you want to use, I've done interesting work with a colleague of mine at Tepper, Kannan Srivastava, where we've looked at the lists of companies and looked at like, well, what are the factors that keep them on or pull them off? And part of what you see is the great companies, the ones that have true staying power and kind of generational legacies around them, they are not one-trick ponies. They come up with new innovations and new products that kind of reinvent their business.
Very clear, and I agree completely. Now, how does a company do that? What are the mechanisms for that in your
well, so I think, I mean, we can unpack this as much as you want, but the simple answer is they need to get back to their entrepreneurial roots, right? And so let's we've done a bunch of definitions so far. Let's give one more, and then I promise we'll be done playing vocabulary games on this talk. But a different definition is, what's a startup, right? A startup is not all entrepreneurs do not run startups, right? If you're an entrepreneur and you're starting a corner coffee shop, and your aspiration is for that to be one corner coffee shop, that is not a startup. Startups are projects that start small with the goal of them becoming big.
Right.
Startups can live inside of brand new companies. They can live inside of big companies. The reality is, for a company, the only type of entrepreneurship that really matters are startups, because small projects that stay small are by definition uninteresting. So what you need to do as a corporation is you need to figure out, okay, how can I actually create a culture, create processes to actually build these startups inside my organization?
Say more. That's what I want to hear more about.
Okay,
How do you do that?
So a couple of things. First of all, and this is now a shot at my book, it's a shot at Eric's book, it's a shot at all these guys. You have to understand that when you go and buy these resources, which were written for 3 people in a proverbial startup garage, right? Some of those things work one for one inside a big company, and some of them don't. And actually, this was the beginning of the corporate startup lab research, which is asking ourselves, what are the things that are similar between, a startup inside, a large retail company and a startup inside the Schwartz Center garage with 3 guys working on it? And at a high level, I think, some of the similarities are the importance of getting customer feedback early in the process is true in both of those worlds, right? It's important in a traditional startup to do that. It's important in a big company to do that, doing startups. But some things are very, very different. And honestly, this is where a lot of the sort of traps come. For example, how you finance a traditional startup and how you provide growth capital for a corporate startup are completely different. So maybe provocative statement number 1 that some people on this webinar may not like. The worst thing you can do if you want to build a corporate startup culture inside your company is create a Shark Tank-like program inside your company, right? So let me tell you what happens. Your CEO opens up the Wall Street Journal, and he's like, that is just not fair. Look at how valuable that company is that just went public via SPAC. My company should be way more valuable than that. How do I get the same premium that company XYZ does? I know I need to make it more entrepreneurial, right? Wrong symptom, but good. I know what I'll do. He turns on CNBC at night, sees some yahoos doing, investment on a 30-minute show that's about as similar to how venture works as the show ER is to how a hospital room works, right? And I know this, like Mark, who spoke at our Schwartz Center earlier this year, we've done deals together. The way Mark behaves in a real deal, Mark Cuban, the way he behaves in a real deal and the way he behaves on the show are not the same thing. It's TV drama. So one, it's not even a good analogy, but 2, and this is important, 2, the reality is, even if it was a good analogy, which it's not, it doesn't matter because there is no such thing as venture capitalists that fund corporate startups, right? If you're doing a startup, and Paul, you've done these, if you're doing a startup and you pitch one seed stage investor, say you pitch me at Birchmere, and I tell you that's a terrible idea, you can say, well, you just didn't get it. Thank you very much. And go pitch another 999 other seed stage funds that look exactly like me.
Right.
If I'm the CFO of, your Publix grocery store, and I tell you that that's a terrible idea, you've got a hill to climb that just may not be climbable at this point, right? So when you think about similarities and differences, financing completely different. So hopefully that's set up that there's some things that are similar, some things that are different. Now, with that lens, then what you want to do is you want to ask yourself some questions. Coming back to this, how do you create startups inside your company? One, how much of, and again, this is through the lens of what can you borrow from startups, what can you not? One, how much of this do you want to do what I would call inside out innovation? And what I mean by that, Paul, is small groups of people inside the company creating startups with the goal of them becoming big projects, versus how much of this do I want to do outside in? I think many companies miss this concept that there's a huge opportunity for transformational innovation from what I might call excavating or external innovation, where you're partnering, collaborating with university groups, with startups, things like that. So that's sort of the first why in the road. Then let's stay focused on the inside out innovation, just because I think that's probably easier for people to get their head around. When you're thinking about it there, don't just do one or two of these, right? You need to do a number of these for them to work, right? If you're literally just going to say, I'm going to try one internal startup, hope it works out, and then make a decision on if I'm good at innovation or not based on that one, you might as well go to Las Vegas. That just does not work, right? What you want to do is you want to say, okay, I'm going to do 30 of these, and I'm going to reduce those 30 down to 10 and those 10 down to 5. And you build a funnel. And some of you are thinking like, well, yeah, we do stage gate, Sean. That's not new. Okay, well, how many of your ideas have you actually killed at gate 1 and 2 in your starts over the last year? So it's like real stage gate right here. It should be thesis driven. I mean, there's a bunch of sort of threads we can pull on here, Paul, but I think the point is you want to sort of understand the strategy, build the process, and then give your teams the right tools and group those teams together in the right way to actually create these projects.
So I agree with you completely that you can't incubate one, that you have to do many.
Yep.
But the challenge I think that I've seen, and I think this is still currently the case, that I, as you said, have to make an argument to a CFO internally. What's in it for that person to see in me something that he or she may not have a clue about? Because if we're going from a good company to a great company, then that CFO is not yet capable of seeing outside of the scope of this narrow language that's been generated. So how do they get educated?
So there is a huge education problem with the finance department, and we can, again, when we do day-and-a-half programs with exec ed regularly on this. So for what it's worth, like I think it's going to be hard to give you a punchy answer to this, but let me give you some top-level thoughts here. One, you got to stop using the two worst 3 letters in corporate innovation, which are IRR and NPV. IRR and NPV are the assumptions behind both of those calculations are that the outcomes look like a bell curve.
Can you unpack them a little bit?
Sure.
I'm not sure the whole audience would know what those are.
Oh, okay. So these are calculations that companies use to understand if a major investment in a project makes sense for them to make or not. So something that you are going to capitalize over multiple years, if you're saying, is this a good capital investment or a bad capital investment, you can use IRR and NPV, so internal rate of return and net present value, that's what the acronyms stand for, to understand if they're good or bad decisions and to compare them on a relative basis, right? So that works really well when the average outcome is kind of the midpoint on a bell curve, if you imagine a bell curve. The average outcomes, and then 1 or 2 standard deviations in either direction gets you to most of the likely outcome. The problem is it relates to innovation that doesn't work really well. So I'll give you a very good retail example of this. So we partnered with a very large, you would know it, one of the 3 largest telecommunications companies in the US. And they were evaluating their innovation investments using those metrics. And they were using those metrics the same way they would evaluate a decision to open a new retail location in Times Square. And the problem with that, right, is if that cell phone company looked at what their retail location in Columbus Circle did and said, oh, you know, I bet plus or minus 1 standard deviation on a cost adjusted basis, which you can do because you can say price per square feet to cost it. Like, I believe it'll end up kind of generally in that direction. That's absolutely right. And if you do 10 of them, 8 to 9 of those 10 are going to kind of be within 1 standard deviation of the mean there, right? Now, if I say, hey, should you build this brand new thing that could completely change your business? It could, you know, grow your revenue per account by 10% for all of your small businesses, right? The likelihood of that succeeding is it does not look like a bell curve at all. It looks more like an L curve, right? Or a power law curve. Most of them don't work at all, but a few of them, when they work, they pay things off. Well, here's the problem with IRR and NPV. The calculation assumes the outcome looks like a bell curve, and it does not look like a bell curve, right? So you need to help your finance department understand that the calculations that they're asking you to jump through don't work in the context of transformative innovation, because the way transformative innovation works is that most don't work, most go to zero, but the ones that do work, they do so well that they end up paying back multiples of all the investment made across all of those ideas.
Okay, got it. I want to turn it around for a second, in part selfishly, to talk about ENAiBLE just for a minute. A lot of what we're interested in is introducing new technologies to companies. But of course, we realize, per the intro that Andrew gave, it's not just a matter of, oh, we buy it off the shelf, we're done, right? So there are design issues, there are interaction design issues, people to machine issues, by which I mean that, but also organizational change issues, which, as I've said, is an interest of mine. Can you talk about it from that point of view? So let's say a company comes along and heard Andrew Lee's talk a month ago and said, yeah, this recommendation engine stuff, give me some of that. How do you go from, you see what I mean? That there are these.
Yeah, there's an English to English translation problem, right? You know, Andrew and I do a program together for a major health insurance company called AI for their business leaders. And the reason we do this is that company got really tired of their senior executives telling their technology groups, hey, can you sprinkle a little AI or sprinkle a little machine learning, just like magic pixie dust, into this problem, and I'm sure it will work out fine, right? And the problem is not that either side was bad. I mean, we've now gotten to know most of that senior leadership team. Like, they're all good folks, but they just don't know, and they end up both talking English, but talking different versions of English, right? So there is some amount of just education that I think becomes really important, Paul. I think there's also around this people and sort of organizational behavior and teams kind of questions. There's just a lot there as well. And I would say that this is an area that I don't have good answers, but I do have good questions. And so I'll just kind of frame the question maybe, right? So when I think about similarities and differences between a traditional startup and a corporate startup, as it relates to teams, over the last 20 years, we've actually gotten really good at understanding what a good founding team for a high growth startup looks like. Basically, everybody in that high growth startup has one of 3 jobs. They build stuff, they make stuff, they build stuff, they make stuff. And what I mean is they sort of act as a bridge, or what you, Paul, would call a designer, right? So they're like people who are like hands-on keys engineering stuff, you might call a hacker. They're sort of making these connections between the market and the builders, what you might call a designer, or they sell stuff, right? So hacker, hustler, designer would be the sort of 3 general rules that you'd say. And what I can tell you is, in traditional startups, you don't necessarily have only 3 people, but everybody at the early stages does one of those 3 jobs or some combination of those 3 jobs, and everything else is noise. Now, when you think about a corporate startup, I actually think there are roles that are missing there. And I actually think also that certain elements look differently, like the sell stuff. For many of these things, sell stuff is not actually selling stuff, it's selling it internally so that you can draft off the incumbency. So we don't actually know the right sort of team composition as it relates to corporate startups today, like we do traditional startups. But it's an area that I think is incredibly exciting. It's something that we're looking at actively right now. We're doing proactive research projects right now with some of our OB and social network professors, because we want to understand this more. Because if we could figure out the optimal mix, and I think you still need people who make stuff, and you still need people who do the design stuff.
Sure.
But I suspect there's other things. I also think that in general, some of the allergies we have in traditional startups don't work in corporate startups. So one of the heuristics most investors will tell you for high growth startups is, if the team is not fully committed to the idea, as in 100% focused on working on it, you have a commitment problem, and that should be a red flag. Well, in most corporate startups, you have senior sponsors who are by definition part-time on it, because they're providing the political cover to do it by also making the rest of the business work well.
Yeah.
So like, I think we're still figuring that out. I think it's actually one of the things that honestly makes me excited when I read things like your the little gray book that you came out with, right? Like, to me, like, these are interesting sort of provocative thought exercises around, okay, here's how someone who's an expert in human computer interaction, complex systems, like, here's how they would think about that. Here's the analogies and so to me, like, that becomes, good fodder as we try to figure out the right team composition for these kinds of projects.
Yeah, Sean's referring to a work that we'll make available afterwards as a link, and I'm sure we'll add a lot of Sean's efforts and a series of links that folks who are attending here can get to. We'll mention that again later, I'm sure. So back to this idea, linking a couple of things together, and then we'll start Q&A in a few minutes. The idea of having multiple internal entrepreneurial activities is, what that says to me is, that's pure evolution and natural selection, right? You want to seed a bunch of things, and then you want to keep giving resources to the good ones, and then let the other ones go. As you say, very rarely do you really cut something off. How often do you say no in the early stage gate? I appreciate all of that. What's implied there, though, which I think needs to be pulled out for the sake of the companies in our audience, is there's a protective quality that is necessary, in my view. In other words, you have to be willing to take risks on a lot of different things, and somebody has to cover for that, right?
Yeah. Somebody
has to say, no, we are going to do all 10 of these things. We're not going to do 1 or 2 of them. And that role is a sort of natural selection role. Like, let's look carefully and see which ones are doing better, and then let's take the hard decision to get rid of others. Isn't it a fact, let me put it that way, that in big companies, even getting started with those ideas are a problem? When you say you need 10, I'm thinking, what companies do 10? Is that really something that even large corporations who have the resources to do it can imagine doing, or even 5?
So I think increasingly, I'm optimistic that increasingly the answer is yes to that. Okay. I do think that there's an education within the finance department that's necessary for a lot of these. The thing I always say there is, we have to understand that the reason the CFO is using IRR and NPV is because he probably came to a place like Tupper where they taught him those calculations, right? And so it's comfortable for him or her. And the reality is, we need to give them other calculations that are comfortable for them to do the right kind of math. And so that's where I think things like option pricing become really interesting math that they're comfortable with, that allows them to calculate it differently. They're also, if you think about most of these big companies, they're making asset allocation decisions for their corporate treasury that involves allocations to different classes of, and effectively creating kind of portfolio effects for how they're managing their treasury. So they understand these principles, but they just don't tend to think about them in the context of making big capital investments. And so you need to help sort of build that bridge there. Some companies do seem to struggle with coming up with ideas, but I would say many others, actually, the gem of an idea is not a problem. Like, many companies have plenty of decent like starts of the idea. What they don't have is a great way for their for people in the company, and remember, companies are just groups of people, so people within the company, to actually pick up that gem of an idea and quickly, with very little bureaucracy, figure out if it's a good or a bad idea. So one of the things that one of the companies we worked with did is they just created a program where like pretty much anybody with almost no questions asked could get a couple $1,000s and a few days of time to sort of see, is this a good or a bad idea? Where they just said, I'm working on this. And then they took the output of that and submitted it to some group that was responsible for innovation, right? That's a great way to take these ideas that people have as they kind of go through their days and think about, okay, let's try to get 50, 100 of them in the top of the funnel so that we can begin to do sorting, organizing, things like that.
So the challenge culturally really is to get comfortable with that aspect of it.
And I think get comfortable and make this. So I think on the culture side, that's one of the two. The other big culture thing I would say is there is a problem as well, which is that we use the same word, failure, to describe two different experiences that happen inside a company that are actually two very different things. One type of failure is you just did the wrong kind of work. You know, we talked earlier about the importance of getting customer feedback. You didn't go talk to customers. That was a mistake. That was not doing the right process. That we need to fix that, coach you up, put a better process in place. The other type of quote unquote failure is you started with a leap of faith around this big transformative idea. You quickly figured out that that leap of faith was incorrect, and you killed the idea. That's not a failure in the same way that not talking to customers is, but we call those both failures. And the reality is, one of those types of failures, you should coach them up, you should fix the process, whatever. The other type of failure, you basically should promote the person, or at a minimum, try to get them more money to do that again. And, and it's that's the other sort of cultural evolution that I see being a challenge for a lot of these companies.
Great. Wonderful.
Hey, Paul, Sean, I don't want to, I imagine some of our audience is going to be mad that I just interrupted. I want to leave some time for
great
questions from the audience, which we've gotten a bunch of. In fact, I'm just going to dive right in. The first question, normally I would paraphrase, but I think it was asked so perfectly, I'm just going to read it verbatim, if that's okay. All right. So given what was said about the difference in financing between entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs, are there large companies that establish more than one internal financing mechanism so that an intrapreneur, has more than one opportunity to convince the company or part of the company to sponsor his or her idea?
Yeah, so the short answer is typically not by design, but typically organically, the answer is yes. And so what I mean by that is the best corporate entrepreneurs that I've spent time with, and I've had a lot of them on my podcast, and we've talked about it on there. So if you go to Agile Giants, you can hear someone talk about this. But the best corporate entrepreneurs have 3 or 4 pockets of different budgets that they can pull from to kind of make these things work. So that decreases the chance of one single no killing a given idea because you have multiple pools to pull from. I'm not aware of anybody, there may be someone who's doing this, but I'm not aware of anybody who's systematically created different initiatives sort of by design, but you see it kind of more organically happen. I do think though, it does sort of frame also one other important related point here, which is because most corporate entrepreneurs come up through one discipline, they're really good at answering objections from one type of executives. So like if you come up through IT, you're really good at talking to the CIO about it. If you come up through marketing, you're really good at talking to the CMO about it. But the reality is that the other side, you've got a bunch of other sort of roles in the organization who are going to weigh in and get to know you. And so one of the other things that we did, which is actually proven to be really, really helpful for people around the challenges, we created just a simple thinking canvas, which we call pitching innovation to the C-suite. And what we did is we took common questions for each of those different departments, marketing, IT, finance, operations, and we encourage entrepreneurs, corporate and traditional for what it's worth, to think through the answers to those questions. Because what I've seen a lot is it's not that you coming up from IT don't have good answers for the marketing question. It's just that question may feel less obvious to you than it does to somebody with a marketing background. Paul, I don't know if you want to add anything to that or.
No, agree. All good.
That's awesome. So I'm gonna pivot a little for the next question. As a side note to the folks in the audience, there's that Q&A function that you have. We're seeing all of the questions. Okay, so even if I kind of don't prompt you with a "we will ask that," your question is seen and hopefully will get asked. As a separate kind of orthogonal question, and this is broad, maybe on purpose, both Sean and Paul. What is the average level of investment in terms of money and time that you think is required for a corporate startup idea to get to that kind of optimal product market fit? And maybe to narrow things slightly, let's assume we're talking about a new business area here, right? Rather than kind of like a step up in the same direction.
Sorry, Paul, you look like you're going.
I was going to jump in quickly and maybe you can elaborate. What is the average level of investment of money and time? In terms of time, it might be half an hour. In other words, how do you spend your time taking that idea and expressing it in a way that you can then test for research, is what Sean said a minute ago. I can't speak to the money idea. I'll leave that to Sean. But it shouldn't take a long time to have a series of confirmations that this is something that will be valuable in the marketplace. And that doesn't have, you can't name that as 6 months or 2 years. I think it's a matter of incremental improvement. I take this from the design process, right? I can draw a scribble and say that's my first sketch of the design, and then I do it better and better and better. It's iterative all the way out. So time-wise, I wouldn't use that as a metric, but I'm sure Sean can say something better about the money side.
So I thought that was really important. Let me just sort of, because I think, and I apologize, I promised we were done defining terms, but I think product market fit is worth defining as well, because it's not a term people may not be universally known, right? So product market fit comes from Mark Andreessen, either the inventor of the web browser or the founder of Andreessen Horowitz, depending on how old you are. But he said product market fit is the most important thing for startups. And before you get to product market fit, it should be all you're focused on. And product market fit is simply defined as a product that solves a real problem for a defined group of customers that's a big enough market that you can achieve your ambitions, right? So those are sort of the three criteria. Do you have product market fit?
Which, by the way, is an evolutionary argument, right?
Yes.
It's pure an organism in an environment succeeding.
I think, exactly. If you guys haven't, so that made a ton of sense to me. If you haven't read Paul's Little Gray Book yet, you should read it. That will make even more sense and feel even more profound after you read his book. But yes, totally agree, Paul. So if you're thinking about getting to product market fit to this design, I think this is actually where we can learn a lot from people who have more of a design and a design thinking background. What you want to do is you want to iteratively go through that, right? Or what Eric Ries calls build, measure, learn. You build something minimal, you get customers' feedback on that, you learn from that, and that continues to iterate your way until you get to product market fit. And I think the challenge is you can quickly start getting signal incredibly quickly, just like Paul said, right? You can draw a sketch, hold it up to somebody, and that can give you kind of a quick first, are we heading in a good direction or not? The interesting challenge becomes like to actually figure out, does this solve a problem? Does it solve it in a big, like that's going to take months. And the best work I can point to on this, unfortunately, comes from the traditional startup side, not the corporate startup side. So a group out at Berkeley created a research project for a number of years called the Startup Genome Project, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's mapping like a human genome, but a startup genome, progress of about 4,000 startups longitudinally across about 5 years, I want to say. It was 4 or 5 years. And what they found is to get to product market fit took about twice as long as the entrepreneurs estimated on the front end. And in my kind of qualitative experience in corporate startups, I think you see the same things there, that it takes much longer than people think to really firmly check those boxes. And the reason this is important is that one of the big temptations in traditional and corporate startups is to what I would call prematurely scale, which is start to focus on things that come post product market fit before you've cleanly checked those boxes that get you to product market fit. And so I think from an expectation standpoint, what you want to do in terms of thinking about investments of money and time is you want to make sure that you have some type of outside governing group At GE, they call these startup boards, for what it's worth, corporate startup boards, but you can call it whatever you want, who are responsible for checking in on those innovations on a regular basis, with the metric being, what did you learn? And are we really at product market fit or not? And try to create a mechanism where you have patience for this taking longer than you might think on the front end. And what I would encourage the attendees to think about is, okay, can you make those investments in this iterative way where you're evaluating, okay, did we learn what we want? Are we one step closer through these build, measure, learn cycles to getting there or not? And evaluate those across a portfolio of them. So what I would say is, like, there should be defined resources managed by some external group. Again, the startup board is an interesting way to do that, who are patiently letting the startups go through that iteration, go through those build, measure, learn iterations, and then typically a separate mechanism to try to scale these things up post product market fit. So one of our collaborators has what they call their company name startup platform. So something startup platform, and that is sort of post product market fit, how you scale those up. And when you look across a lot of these companies, you'll see different people have different competencies at these different things, and you sort of budget and manage them differently. And so pool of capital, patient from idea to product market fit, and then scaling mechanisms post product market fit. Hopefully that answered the question and kind of what you were looking for. You have follow-ups, we'd love to hear that as well, but that was sort of my quick read on what you'd asked there.
Sean, Paul, thanks. I'm gonna pivot again just because of there's been a very diverse set of questions. So now pivoting to kind of the lens we've been talking from the point of view of companies as a whole, and there's a question that kind of requires, I think, switching to the lens of the founding team and kind of employees, right? And the question I just want to read is what are some of the common reasons that someone would pursue an entrepreneurship when they could, wholly own that product outside of the company's fences?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. So a couple of things I think are important to say here. One, there are certain types of innovation that are actually much easier to do inside a big company than outside of it. There are other types of innovation, bluntly, that are much easier to do outside the company too, right? So this is not a religious statement, it's just an observation. We do a lot of work here at Carnegie Mellon with PNC and PNC's Numo group, right? Which is PNC's FinTech Accelerator. They launched a product called Indy about a year ago, which is a bank account for gig economy workers. Turns out it's actually really hard to deal with the regulatory constraints to launch a bank account like that for gig economy workers, especially when it doesn't cleanly fit into the categories that the regulators would think about. Is this a business account or a personal account? That's an easier innovation to do inside a bank like PNC than it is to do outside of a bank. So some ideas just fit better in one case or the other. The other part of it, though, is from the entrepreneur's perspective. What I like to say is you want the outcome to be similar on a risk-adjusted basis. So if you and 3 guys are willing to go sleep under your desk, and your CEO, she's willing to basically go all in, eat ramen noodles, and just make it work, and the CTO, she's willing to quit her job at Google that's paying her $500,000 a year and go all in on the startup, then given the risk that you're taking, the reward needs to be equally large. There are other people who frankly can't take that kind of risk, right? So they don't necessarily need the same reward basis that the people dropping out and sleeping under their desk need and going without salary for a year, but they need still an appropriate amount of upside given the sort of similar risk that they're taking. And so for some people, frankly, that super high risk, no salary, kind of jumping without a parachute, it's just not within scope for them. And so this becomes the only thing that's relevant for them. And so coming back to this, not relegating entrepreneurship to certain types of people, right? I don't want entrepreneurship to just be something that people who can afford to not draw a salary for 18 months do, right? And I think corporate entrepreneurship is a good part of the solution there.
I agree with all of that, Sean. A complementary view, not in the sense of a complement to that dimension, but in a different dimension. Was that redundant? Anyway, the key for me is always, will it survive? Can you bring up a set of ideas in a given context? And are you able to make the argument and to convert those into seeing the world the way you see the world or not? And of course, it's not a binary thing. It's something that may take time to do. I think it's one of those unknowables in advance, and it's just a matter of trying. And then I think it does become a personal choice in a risk situation, as Sean has described. Yeah.
I mean, think about chemical engineering startups, right? Like it's, you know, it's really hard to build a chemical startup as 3 guys in the Schwartz Center garage. We don't actually want them mixing chemical cocktails in the Tupper Quad, as it turns out.
Right. And you've got the computational power to do almost anything you want to do from software point of view. Yeah,
that's right.
Exactly.
Different problems, different scopes,
domain.
different types of people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we ask one last question from the audience, which I think is a good exercise in kind of the important terms defined. And I think this one might be a good kind of test for all of us. So in fact, I'm going to read it verbatim because it would be insulting others. What is the difference between having internal, innovative, agile product teams versus investing in defined entrepreneurship? I'm going to read it again. What is the difference between having internal, innovative, agile product teams versus investing in defined entrepreneurship?
Can I throw something fast, Sean? And you can
Sure,
respond?
go ahead.
So innovative, agile product teams imply you know what you're doing and you have the product in mind. And that sounds consistent with the existing business. Entrepreneurship sounds like a fork in the road, as Sean was saying earlier so eloquently. A different business could spin out of the current business, and no great company is single-minded. That would be my difference.
Yeah, I think that's great. Andrew, you know, one of the things I've learned as a business school professor is you can't actually finish a talk without at least one 2x2 matrix. And I'm getting very, very nervous that we're almost at the end and you're going to send a note to Isabel like, well, he was fine, but there was no 2x2s. I'm not sure he's a real colleague or not. So
Isabel being the dean of the school.
That's right, the dean of Tepper. That's right.
Yeah.
But I actually think this conveniently actually is a really nice, does fit into a really nice 2x2, which is how well do you know the problem and how well do you know the solution? So if you think about 4 boxes with, you know, known or unknown problem and known and unknown solution as kind of 4 boxes here, right? What I would say is Agile, to Paul's point, is really, really effective when you know the problem, but you need to take some iterative approach to the right solution to that problem, right? So it's like, oh, I know I need to build this thing, but I don't know exactly how to do it. Okay, well, let's use a tool like Scrum or whatever Agile methodology you want to do to sort of iteratively map to that solution, right? When I think about kind of corporate startups, or to use the term in the question, these defined entrepreneurship, I think about that much more as unknown problem, unknown solution, right? And I think there is where you want to take this more startup approach. And it turns out, like, for what it's worth, if you know the problem and you know the solution, like neither of those are actually that great an approach, right? If you really know exactly what you want to build, and you know exactly how to build it, and you know the right solution for it, you probably should just use waterfall. I mean, I might lose Paul because the CS professors certainly aren't going to love a plug for waterfall, but the reality is like that's like that, you know, design it, build what you designed, validate that you built what you designed, and like that's actually pretty efficient.
In the face of certainty, that is the most efficient.
That's right. Now, I would argue nobody on this webinar should spend much of their professional life focused on known problems with known solutions. Like that work is definitely vulnerable for the red AI that's on the logo behind each of us. And it's also, even if you can't automate it with AI and machine learning, you can certainly outsource it to cheaper solutions than the kind of places and roles that all of us want to have. But now coming back to this Agile versus kind of corporate startups, right? now we get to this like, okay, we don't exactly know the solution, but do we really know the problem or not? And depending on the answer to that, I think it leads us to this, what's the right approach to doing it? And certainly across a portfolio of investments that you're making, you need to do some of these incremental improvements that you can, frankly, pretty efficiently do with something like an agile product team. That makes a ton of sense. But you also need to be spending some of your resources on these more transformational ideas. And that's what we're trying to focus on as it relates to corporate startups.
So I think the timing is perfect now. I want to offer a soft pause to kind of everyone in the audience, right? This was a 1 hour event, and I'm going to kind of offer the closing, the version of closing remarks that I have. But I want to encourage anyone in the audience that if you still have questions, I can guarantee we have the availability for another 30 minutes worth of questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer the what are supposed to be the closing remarks, but please, if you got questions, we'll be on, and you should feel free to stick them into the Q&A. I just want to offer the option of the soft departure. So just to everybody that came, thank you very much. In particular, thank you to our speakers, Sean and Paul, who will be staying on. So maybe I'll give you a harder thank you later on. I do want to thank the folks that made this event possible. Right, that includes our kind of support staff, Kenny Blair and Laura Alford, co-lead on our team, Chris Kissel, and our sponsors at ENAiBLE. To the audience, I want to make sure that please stay tuned for future events. We've got these pretty much monthly now. I encourage you to check out our website. That's again, cmu.edu/ENAiBLE. Right? And there you're going to find information on our mission, our activities, and recordings of this event and every event that we've done up until now. Level 2 of this is that you should definitely let us know, give us feedback on the areas that you're focusing on, that you're concerned about, that you're thinking about. Okay, that really dictates the kinds of events that we host, right? And you can do that either at our website through our contact page or directly through enable@cmu.edu. And finally, I want to encourage you to think about becoming a sponsor. So we're accepting those opportunities. It's kind of much to be gained by becoming a sponsor, but ultimately that's the primary way for you to participate in our community of technology plus design innovators. I've put a list here of kind of things you can gain through that, but for more information, you should again reach out to Chris Kissel at enable@cmu.edu. If you're leaving us at this soft stop, I'm going to say thanks and hope that you join us for our next event. Right.
I just want to throw in a real thanks to Sean for joining us, and I recommend his book, The Science of Growth, which I think is an extremely carefully done thing. Science, I love science in the title. That's great. Maybe we can write a book together, Sean, about the evolution of growth in entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship. I think there's something to that.
Love it.
So thanks a lot for coming. And again, if folks have questions or would like to continue here, we can. We have some other questions that we've thought of that we might.
There are certainly still, yeah. So there are questions kind of oncoming. Again, this is just the kind of if you had a hard stop at 2:30, this is the moment. And again, the recording is being posted.
Yep.
And without further ado, I'm gonna jump right in, Sean and Paul, if that's okay.
Sure.
Back to our questions. So this is a good one. Is there a space where the audience can learn from somebody else's failures, basically? Let me just read the whole question. As an example, Clubhouse co-founders have a record of being two serial socialpreneurs who failed their way to creating the next big social app. Could AI be used to scan the failure patterns? Read that one more time. So is there a space where we can learn from someone's series of failures? The example being Clubhouse co-founders having a record of being two serial socialpreneurs who have failed their way to creating the next big social app. And could AI be used to scan their failure patterns? Sorry.
It's a great question. I'd like to jump in, but I also want to hear what Sean would say.
Go ahead, Paul.
And I know the questioner, a close colleague and a very smart character, Claudine. I think the side of the road is littered with the ideas that got left behind in order to find the right way. I don't think that there's a pattern there. I don't think there's enough data to set an AI looking at it to find the pattern. I think it's that evolutionary story again. And again, to mention Sean's book, The Science of Growth, he does these comparisons between companies that we know of today and the company that tried to do the same thing and failed. Sean and I both know Bill Gross of Idealab, famously, who a few years ago did a study of 50 of his companies and 50 other companies. And he found that the most important thing was not the money, not the team, not the idea, but the timing, which is also a plug for an evolutionary view of all of this stuff, right? Is the fit right now? And that was the long story we had before about the product market fit. That's a matter of coming to the right evolutionary moment to really be able to scale and grow. So I don't see a pattern that one can learn from, but Sean may have a different answer.
Yeah, so I think that there are lessons at different points along the way that you could point to, but I think it's certainly never going to be as prescriptive as probably what the question is looking for here. So I think both things like what Bill did with his study that got around to really looking at this answer of why now around innovation is incredibly important, I would argue, pre-product market fit. I would also say that this element of prematurely scaling is a big part of it, that you start focusing on scaling before you truly solve a problem in a meaningful enough way, right? So for example, if you think about, worrying about, okay, how do I pour a bunch of money into sales and marketing to make people aware of my service? Well, if the service isn't good enough to get people to change their behavior, or what, he's not here any longer, but the guy who actually helped us start the entrepreneurship program at Carnegie Mellon, Don Jones, used to call the goodness factor, right? Don would say, how much in a quantifiable way is this better than the alternatives, right? If you start trying to scale up before you have a solid goodness factor, or before the timing is right, like you will absolutely prematurely scale and waste a lot of money. One of the things that we've become really interested in, and this really gets to something that Paul, frankly, could talk about more eloquently than me, but I've become really interested in, is I think the first interaction with a given product is incredibly important, right? Because that first time you pick a product up and use it, that anchors a lot of how you think about it.
Yes.
And it changes a lot of the things that happen kind of post scale up, because you influence things like how viral is the product, how easy is it for this to draft into existing solutions, right? So I think many startups, corporate and traditional, underinvest in that first interaction with their given product. And if you're not comfortable with that, think about things you can learn from industries that may seem far afield for you. So, I know that this is mostly focused on retail and service industries, but what could the retail and service industries learn from the video game industry about a first interaction with the product or service, right? And maybe there's opportunities for ENAiBLE to collaborate with our colleagues at the ETC around that. So there's a bunch of these different things, but I think going back to Claudine's question, I think unfortunately, those are more like, here are some best practices that you should keep in mind. Ask yourself the why now question, ask yourself what the goodness factor is, than they are these sort of prescriptive things.
Just quickly, a couple of things that Sean said. ETC here at Carnegie Mellon is the Entertainment Technology Center, where the word games doesn't describe sufficiently what world they move in and how they innovate in that world. That's a very important point. But I think the other thing you said is also quite important, which is how that first moment unfolds is extremely important. There was research done many years ago about reviews of movies. So the movie comes out, what are the first reviews like? If they're a little bit good, it goes up really nicely. If they're a little bit bad, it goes down really nicely, independent of the quality of the movie. So those first impressions are important. And in the case of design, that's where they manifest. It's that first moment of delight, or what we call the micro interactions. How does it bounce? How does it, pulse? What is the thing that's attracting me? What is that ease? Another word colleagues of mine and I use. There's a cost to using something, a biological cost. Is it hard to learn? Is it hard to understand, how to figure out? Do I have to remember it? Is it difficult? All those things. So that moment of delight would be another way of saying it's very important. Great point, Sean.
If you, sorry, just to pick up on that for 1 minute more, because I think this is the kind of thing that a lot of sort of businesses tend to push off as like, well, that's a consumer tech problem, but that's not true. That's not true for me. And I think that's just a incorrect way to look at it. One of my favorite things to point out is like, well, think how much time people spend watching unboxing videos on YouTube. Like if you've never, like go to YouTube and search for unboxing, right? You'll see like, and it's kids' toys. If you have kids under 10, you've probably watched them, you've seen them watch other kids unbox toys, right? Or it's video games and cell phones.
Yeah. What a revolution. It was a revolution in realizing that that was an important part of the user experience.
That's right. And so here's what typically someone says, and no one's put this in the chat yet, but if I paused another minute or two, someone would say this. They'd say, yeah, that's true. But not for like real adults. That's true for like 20-something guys who care about electronics, and that's
we're
true
all
for
human
kids.
beings, right? Well, we're all human beings.
Here's my favorite back and forth on this. I did this I said, well, what's your favorite TV channel to watch at night? This was like a 50-year-old middle executive at a large company you would know. And she's like, oh, I love watching HGTV. I said, well, HGTV is like, ask your average TV producer what they think about HGTV. It's basically unboxing real estate, right? Like the entire meme of the show is this build up to watch the person unbox their house. Now, it turns out a house feels like a very mature thing to care about unboxing. A cell phone, less so, and Play-Doh, way, way less so. But it's the same. We care a ton about this first interaction. And I think in retail today, that's a fascinating opportunity for kind of innovation around retail and services.
Great.
Guys, I think we have an opportunity for one more question. Again, kind of orthogonal here, but paraphrase. So our questioner heard a story from Alibaba, an entrepreneurship attempt here, right? And the story goes like, in an attempt to kind of motivate their spirit, right? Alibaba basically removed that safety net, right? Stock options and whatever safe benefits. There's no guarantee this is true. The questioner makes sure to say, but in any case, right? Is there kind of merit to that, right? Is there kind of you guys talked about the safety net being kind of a good thing in terms of entrepreneurship, but could that get in the way of what you might call true entrepreneur spirit, right? And getting from higher management's perspective, getting the most capacity out of these folks, right? What are your thoughts on that? Removing that safety net.
So I don't know if the story is true or not. So, but here's an observation that I had as I was reading the question, right? So I would not consider stock options for what they're worth a safety net, right? Stock options in a business like Alibaba are upside, but they're sort of very risk-adjusted upside, right? And it turns out sometimes they work out really well. I was talking to a friend who's a very senior executive at Tesla. He thought his options were going to be worth, 10 to 20 million. It turns out options in RSUs, it turns out thanks to the run the company's had in the last couple of years, they're worth hundreds of millions, right? So they do have a nice variance of outcomes, but they're sort of controlled in a certain way. What I think is interesting about the way the question is asked is, to me, that you're not actually asking the employees to give up the safety net, which I would argue is not great, because part of the reason people choose corporate entrepreneurship is the safety net. What you're asking them to do is say, I'm going to trade modest upside, so modest ceiling, modest floor for higher variance outcomes with equity within the corporate startup that I'm doing. I think that's very, very interesting. I don't know if it's true or not. I don't, there's, you know, I'll put all the caveats you want around it, but just conceptually, I think it's a really interesting thing, which is saying like, look, your currency needs to be this startup, like the chance to change you and your family's life needs to be driven around this corporate startup, but we'll still provide you benefits. We'll still provide you, you know, the salary, health insurance, the things that you might need as a, you know, 40-something executive who needs to make sure their kids can eat and health insurance is covered. Paul, I don't know if you had any.
No, I don't have much to add. I think your business view of that is more important. I think it's great.
So I don't think we have one more question. So I wanted to, because I wanted to leave the retail attendees with another challenge, which is, in addition to all the things we've talked about today, don't miss opportunities for business model innovation as well, right? And I think the great business model innovation of the last 12 months has been big established companies transitioning transactional revenue to subscription revenue, right? So the best example is Disney, right? Disney is going to pass Netflix in the next couple of years for the most streaming subscribers. People would have put Netflix in the Apple category 5 years ago, right? That if I had used Netflix as an example 5 years ago, someone would say, you can't use Netflix as an example. They're exceptional, right? But what Disney has done is they've said, you know what? It turns out we have some incredible incumbency advantage that Netflix, good for you, but it turns out Star Wars as a franchise, Mickey Mouse as a franchise, like those are hard to compete with. And what you've seen is you know what? The incumbents can dance, and not only can the incumbents dance, but they can push back hard against these traditional companies. And so a challenge in the retail space is, how can you think about similar business model innovation? And I think what Panera is doing is a fascinating example of this, right? So Panera launched in February, so about a year ago now, subscription coffee. They said, pay us $9 a month and you can get as much coffee as you want from us. Come in anytime and you can get free coffee effectively because you have a monthly pass for all you can drink coffee, right? Now, the last time Panera reported results on this was October. So about halfway through a year of having launched this. At that time, they had 500,000 people paying them $9 a month for their coffee. 35% of those subscribers were brand new customers. And this is not the same 35%, but 35% of their orders placed that had the coffee subscription in it also ordered food, right? The game here is not always AI, although I think there is a ton of data science, machine learning, computer vision, and come over to Carnegie Mellon. We will walk you through the halls and introduce you to all of those things. But when Paul and Andrew talk about business model, culture, and organizational behavior changes as well, what we really want to do, I think, within ENAiBLE, and now I'm speaking on their behalf, so this is more me just sort of projecting, but what I want to see these guys help you do at your grocery store, at your retail chain, at your automotive company, is come up with your own version of the Panera coffee subscription, right? Because it would have been very easy for Panera to say, well, that's great for Disney, but they're a media company. And it'd been very easy for Disney to say, you know what, that's great for all those software companies that do software as a service, but we're in the content business, right? And I think today, there's this opportunity in retail and services to really change the world, make it better, and transform these businesses. And I'm really excited as just a colleague of Andrew and Paul's to watch these opportunities happen over the next couple of years through the ENAiBLE initiative that we've launched here at Carnegie Mellon.
That's great, Sean. Just one final comment from me, and I'll turn it over to Andrew to bring the close. I think we've come full circle now. We're back to saying, how do you see the world? And if you're seeing the world in this narrow way that has been successful for you as a company, there are other ways of seeing, and don't be constrained by this way. Think of alternatives and exactly the analogy of what's the equivalent of a monthly fee for infinite coffee that would bring these other opportunities along the way. That's a beautiful ending, Sean. Thanks. Great to have you here.
Yeah, Sean, Paul, there's absolutely nothing I could say to top that conclusion. So all I'm going to say is to our speakers again, to our guests, Sean Amarati, Paul, thanks for leading the discussion. Thank you very much. The audience, one last time, right? Please do check us out. You've got hopefully the link to our web page. You've got the right email to reach out to us, right? I think this is a great community to kind of discuss these issues and let's say opportunities, right? Even further, right? So we'll leave this page up. You'll find the recording to this on our webpage. Thank you, and kind of stay safe and enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, Sean. All the best.
Thanks, guys.